So today we're going to be doing one of my favorite learning modules at TCL. It's about communication for devs. You all should be seeing my screen now. Let me know if you don't. Um, cool, thanks. So yeah, communication for devs. If y'all don't know, my background before I became a software engineer was in like linguistics and language access and language education. So I really, really, really believe that communication is key. And I think we all kind of are in agreement about that here at Collab Lab. Communication is essential for collaboration, and that's kind of what we're all about. But to kind of start us off, I wanted to ask you all, as developers, what do you think are some forms of communication that we utilize? Um, so, for example, we've talked about how, like, Slack as a form of communication is an easy one. What are some other forms of communication that we utilize, either text-based or like audio-based?
The comments that we leave in our code.
Yeah, that's a really important one. Comments in the code. Nice. Anyone else have any
Meetings,
thoughts? Meetings? Yeah, very, very true.
stand-ups.
Mm-hmm. Stand-ups. Nice. Cool. Yeah, those are some great ones. So we've got a ton. So here are a few examples of types of communication tools that we have at our disposal. Some that we mentioned, we've got like comments, Slack messages, meetings like retrospectives, our demos that we do in these calls, pair programming, there's a lot of communication, comments on people's pull requests, the descriptions that you write on pull requests, your Git commit messages are communication, documentation. I think that's everything on here. So there's a ton, and you all are doing most of these things already. We're just going to focus today on three forms of written communication that are quite common. So these three, so documentation, pull request descriptions, and comments in code, which are three things that you'll use a lot in your arsenal as developers. And so for each of these, we'll talk about what it is, why we need it, and how to use it effectively. So we'll start off with documentation. Does anyone want to tell me what I mean when I say documentation in this context? Or maybe an example of documentation that you've used as a developer.
I'll say the README and the pull request description that we write.
Yeah. Yeah, READMEs are a great example. Yeah, pull request descriptions, we'll get into a little bit more detail in a few slides from here. But there's also things like MDN is a really common source of documentation, or if you're looking into accessibility, something like WCAG or W3C have really extensive documentation. If you're learning a new library like Toastify, you might have to look for their documentation to see, okay, how do I install this new library? What are the different options I can send for using this library? So things like that. So there's a lot of documentation out there. Some of it's better than others. You tend to notice when it's bad and not so much when it's good. But documentation is really helpful for, it's kind of like a manual often, right? So when you have that form of documentation that is like a step-by-step tool to follow or a reference guide to follow as a developer. What are some reasons why we want documentation or why we want to write documentation like that, those kinds of user manual types of documentation?
To help people who will read our code. And yeah.
Yeah, for sure. To help other people, to help ourselves too. Like I have a terrible memory, so I have to write down everything or I will forget it. So so one of the reasons is just to remind ourselves what we did again. Like Raquel was mentioning, like, oh yeah, we did this, but I didn't write it down, so I don't remember why. That happens to the best of us. It happens to me all the time. If I don't write it down, I will not remember. So writing documentation is a great way of just kind of making sure you have that information to reference. And then, of course, Writing things down also helps you to learn. We've talked about that in the context of writing a blog. It's also great in the context of writing documentation. If you write clear instructions, it just kind of solidifies in your mind exactly how to do something. It's a great tool for revisiting big decisions. If this is like your team's documentation, it can be like, oh, why did we decide to use Toastify again? Oh, yeah, these were the reasons. Or why did we want to do this refactoring? You can have documentation that kind of lays out all of the thought process behind something. Very useful for onboarding new team members. That's kind of like what Raquel was getting at, right? If you have someone who's trying to use some kind of tool, you don't want to have to repeat it for every single person who's going to be using it. You can just have one resource, and then if they have questions, they can ask you. But it streamlines things for everyone involved. It also avoids a monopoly on institutional knowledge. So if you have one person on your team who knows everything about this one area of your app or something like that, and then they win the lottery and they leave, are you all going to be okay? Do you have a way of knowing everything that was in their brain? Have they written it down so that you all have access to it? If you are that person and you try and go on vacation, are you having to answer Slack messages all day because you're the only one that knows something? Like, that's not good for anybody. You want to make sure that you can have experts on your team, but you want to make sure that everyone has access to that information in some way. And because the last reason is it empowers all the team members. Everyone has access to the information, even if they're not necessarily considering themselves the subject matter expert. They have access to the information to make sure that they can contribute in a meaningful way. So yeah, documentation is super useful for lots of reasons. As for the how, just a couple of tips for writing really useful documentation. These are two really good kind of things to keep in mind is that you want to balance these two things. You want to write for the person who has the least knowledge on a topic, who knows the least, so that it's really user-friendly, very beginner-friendly. At the same time, you want it to be optimized for the person who just needs a quick reference. So someone who knows the basics can easily jump to the useful information for them, right? So if they say, okay, I know how to get set up and everything, I just want to know specifically like this one implementation thing, I can skip ahead in the documentation. So doing that through formatting. So making sure you have all of the useful information, but formatted in a way using bullet points and headings and things so it's easy to jump to the part that's relevant for you. And this is just an example of documentation, which is React router documentation, right? So this is really useful because if I am just getting started, I can say, okay, I'm just going to start at the very top because I don't know anything. So I'm just going to read from the top. But if I'm like, oh no, I actually specifically want to know how to use this create static handler router, I'm just going to jump to that page, and there's really helpful like code blocks in here. So it's very easy for me to follow along. So it's just one example of how to make it really user-friendly writing your documentation. Any questions about documentation? Cool. All right, we're going to jump to the next one, which I believe is pull requests. Yes. So pull requests. You all know what pull requests are. Does anyone want to remind me what a pull request is?
Merge to the main request.
Yeah, exactly. When you've written your code and you're ready for it to be merged to main, you're going to write a description with information for the rest of your team when they're reviewing your code. Ideally, some people don't write very meaningful pull request messages, and then it's more difficult to review their code as a team member because you don't have any context or anything. This team has been rocking it with the pull requests. They've been beautiful. What are some reasons? Well, I guess I kind of already covered that actually, but so we want our pull requests to be giving the reviewers context on your code, which you all have been doing a really nice job of. Because it just, if you just see like a few code changes and you just see the diff and that's all your context, you have to do a lot more work to say, okay, what is this change going to do? Why are they doing this? And just making a lot of guesses, laying it out is really helpful for your team member to review. And another really useful point for anyone that's on the job hunt is that a big part of interviewing is talking and walking through your code. So having a robust PR description helps you remember what you did. So this is kind of like a cheat sheet for you also. If you're going into an interview, you can be like, okay, I remember that dates were so hard. Let's review like what I was doing with the dates and what went wrong and how I fixed it. And it's kind of like a little mini study guide for you about what you did, why you did it, what changed, and everything like that. So again, all of these different forms of communication, it's a benefit to your team and it's a benefit to you as well to remember what you did. And then as far as some quick tips, again, this is all, I think you've all been doing a great job of this. Screenshots, GIFs, and videos. You all have been doing this with your before and after, and it makes it so much nicer to review because it's very clear, like, okay, this is the particular part of the app that's changed. And I can like easily see, and I know what I'm looking for when I'm reviewing the code. If there's any like links to resources or code that you referenced, that's also a good thing to include in your PR. And then this is a really good point. I don't know if y'all have been doing this or not, but when you create a PR, it's a really good practice to kind of create the PR and then pretend that you are reviewing the PR. Just look through the PR and make sure that everything makes sense. If you see something where you're like, oh, this is actually something we wanted people's opinions on, you can leave a comment on your PR before anyone else has. You can totally leave comments on your PRs too to just highlight, oh, we really want you to pay attention to this part when you're reviewing, or something like that. And also just to make sure you know, if you accidentally left a comment in that you didn't mean to, you can quickly remove that so that you don't have to waste back and forth with someone of making a request like that you can easily do yourself. And we've also talked a lot about keeping your PRs small and narrowly scoped. Again, having one context for your PR just makes it easier for everyone to wrap their head around and to review efficiently. And then if you have another issue, you can make another PR. There's an example of a PR description, but you all know what they are because you've been writing them. So keep doing that. These are all like really, these are things that will make you stand out as a developer because a lot of people don't put time and effort into writing a pull request description, but putting in the time to do that saves everyone else the time of building context for themselves. So it's a really, really useful thing to do and to continue doing. Any questions about PRs?
Yes, I do have one. When
Yeah.
do we know if we are just exaggerating our PR? Because I'm never like the midterm is always all very little too much. So when do I know if I'm not explaining too much and it's going to be too long?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, I mean, honestly, I feel like having more information is better than not having enough information. But also keep in mind the point from earlier about where we want, we were saying for documentation, I can go back to that slide. Here, we want to write for the person who knows the least and optimize for the person who needs a quick reference. We can kind of use this rule of thumb for PRs too, where you have a lot of context if someone wants to really deeply understand something, you have it there, but you're going to format it in a way that's easy for someone to just jump to what's necessary for them. So just like you all use headings in your PRs to make that easy, and bullet points and images, it just makes it really easy for someone to, if they want to read all of it, they can. If they don't, they can skip to the part that's useful. So here we are. But I think also you can get a sense from your team. It's going to vary from team to team what's the norm. And if you want to ask for feedback from people on your team or just kind of get a sense of like what's normal. Although I would say on a lot of teams, it's normal to have like no description. And I would say that that is something that is not helpful to people. So training your team to have more descriptive PRs can be a good thing. And that can be something you can bring to the table, even as a new team member. Does that answer your question? Kind of?
Yeah, it is because with this issue, for example, it is very tricky, and we felt the need to kind of make it more well explained and what we actually did. And I
Yeah.
want, like, oh my God, are we writing too much? Or, yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, sure. The other thing is, for example, in this particular issue, if you write your description and then as you're reviewing your own PR, you can like comment on different areas of the code, like leave a PR comment on areas of your code saying, oh, okay, this is what was happening here. This is the process we went through, just to like keep it more clear what your comments are about, like kind of scope it to particular blocks of code. Because yeah, it's easy to write too much. So another skill of writing is like knowing how to edit it down, but that comes with practice as well. I think it's very normal to be a little bit more like a little bit wordier as you're getting started, and you kind of learn what is the most important information and you start to edit down yourself with practice.
Okay, thank you. I
Okay.
think that's a fantastic idea, the one to add comments. Thank
Yeah,
you.
great, of course. All right, so our last little topic here is comments in code. You all have been doing a great job of writing comments in code. This is another example where it's easy to kind of write a lot, and then you all have already identified as an area to work on is we want to edit down our comments to just what's essential, and we kind of want to remove the ones that are not necessary anymore, which I think is great. You all proactively identified that within your code. But sometimes we do want to leave comments in our code. It's to help your team get more context while they're looking through your code, right? If there's a particular block that's a little bit tricky and you just want to give them a little bit of context to understand why you're doing that, you can leave a comment there. Sometimes you'll hear the argument that code should be self-documenting. Yes, this is true, but sometimes you need the decisions about why something is happening the way it's happening, right? Maybe someone can read your code and understand what is happening, but they don't understand why you're doing it that way. So I don't agree with people that like don't believe at all in code comments. I think sometimes they're very useful and very um, actually good practice to include. And so again, this is another thing where as you become more comfortable with things, you'll kind of start to edit down where you find comments necessary. But I think it's a good practice from the start to over communicate and then work your way down, because some people are kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum where they just don't have any comments and don't have any PR descriptions, don't write any documentation. And I think that's bad because as developers, we're constantly communicating with each other, not just with our computers. So writing these kinds of this communication is really helpful. And then just a couple of tips for how to write comments. Again, focusing on the why rather than what can be helpful. Sometimes it might be a confusing block of code, but it's a good prompt to think, okay, could I refactor this in a way that makes it easier to understand what the code is doing? For example, by renaming a variable so it's clear what I'm trying to do in this code block. Sometimes the answer is no, and sometimes a comment will be good. But generally, the rule of thumb is that using comments to show the why instead of the what is a good rule of thumb there. And then there's an example here. I'll send these slides out after the fact, but there's an example here of a code comment done well. And we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to skip this question because you've all been doing these things very well. So I think it's okay. I do have some resources here. I really love this first video by Sarah Drasner where she's talking about the art of code comments. Highly recommend. And there's also a lot of resources here if you're interested in learning more about effective communication as a developer. So I'll send those out afterwards as well. I'm going to go ahead and any questions about anything that I was talking about there? Yeah, really just keep doing what you're doing. And there's some tips to kind of level up, but I think you all have an amazing foundation for all of this technical communication. All right, I'm going to stop sharing.